everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action podcast. Today, I have got the absolute pleasure of welcoming Dr. Raghu Appasani. He is the co-founder and chief medical officer of Ginko. Dr. Appasani is a board-certified integrative and addiction psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and social entrepreneur. He is the co-founder and chief medical officer of Ginko, the first doctor-backed trusted AI for families, helping parents navigate screen time, social media, and online safety with peace of mind. He is also the founder of the Minds Foundation, a nonprofit advancing global mental health access and literacy. With 20 plus years in mental health care, Dr. Appasani has published 35 plus peer-reviewed papers, delivered 200 plus global talks, and advises several wellness startups. His work has been featured in CNN, Forbes, Vogue, and the Boston Globe, and recognized by the World Economic Forum and Echoing Green, and Arnold P. Gold Humanism Honor Society. Dr. Appasani holds a BA in Neuroscience and Behavior Science in Society from Wesleyan University, earned his MD from UMass Medical School, completed his psychiatry residence at LAC and USC, where he served as chief resident, and pursued an addiction psychiatry fellowship at USCF. He currently lives in San Francisco, CA, and operates a concierge practice. I'm super excited for our conversation, and I can't wait for us to dive in. Well, welcome everybody to this episode, and welcome, Raghu. It's so nice to have you on the podcast with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kirsty, and excited to be here and dive into all the fun stuff.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. I know you have just kind of a whole wealth of experience and story and the journey that you've been on. So with that being said, I always like to ask my guests the same question at the start of the podcast. And really it's because we know how much our early life experiences shape what we do. And so I'm curious, is there anything that you feel in your early life or in your early career that has kind of led you down this path and into the work that you're doing today? Tell us a bit about your story.
Yeah, sure. I think just to answer that at sort of a high level, I would say growing up as the first generation in the US to parents who immigrated from India, and having that connection still to my family abroad and navigating that landscape of both worlds, that definitely has framed a lot of, how I see the world and the work that I do and the importance and the stress that I like to really place on community building. Because that's really how change happens and how we can also sustain ourselves as humans. And so just to backtrack from there a bit, so my parents immigrated in the mid 80s to Boston from India, and then I was born there as the second son and first generation in the US. However, I only stayed with them the first 18 months of my life, and then I actually went and lived with my maternal grandparents and my uncle in a small village in India where my mother grew up. And I was there for until almost I turned 4 years old, and then I returned back to my immediate family as well. So we can think about that from an attachment style and attachment theory aspect of, how that might frame my view of the world. And I think that also allowed me in some ways to be a bit more independent and driven and be attached to both cultures and both worlds. And I've throughout my lifetime figured out how to navigate both of those and really bring them together. And so that has really led to a lot of my journey. I went from there to go to study neuroscience and philosophy in undergrad, started a mental health nonprofit working in rural India, thinking about how to provide access to mental health literacy and education, as well as access to care. And that organization is called the Minds Foundation, and it's still operating since 2010. And so I had an opportunity to really learn a lot through that work about what it takes to truly heal. And again, that comes back to the sense of community and creating spaces where people can feel belonging. I think that's really what's important. And I'm sure we'll get to that later on in sort of modern day society, what belonging and community looks like. And anyhow, all of that led to me going to medical school, which which was definitely a journey in itself. And I continued to pursue neuroscience and psychology, and I ended up training as a psychiatrist and then an addiction psychiatrist, and have a practice now where I really try to meet folks where they're at. So a lot of my work is outside the clinic. It's meeting them in their home, meeting them on hikes or walks, and really trying to figure out, getting them in a place where they're comfortable enough to start to open up and talk. And in a way, it's sort of a selfish career because I get to do what I love, which is be a part of someone's story and listen to their story and just gain a bit more about the human experience. And so, yeah, that's really what drives me to where I'm at now.
Well, thank you for sharing that part of your journey with us. There's so much to unpack with everything that you just said. I'm going to start with so a thought that I had as you were telling us a little bit about your very early start in life. Um, a lot when we talk about attachment theory, there's a lot of conversation about kind of the negative impact of early life experiences, right, on a person's attachment style. Um, I get a sense from you that actually your early life experiences aired on maybe the side of positive, that even though you had this kind of big move between family, that it actually that you maybe thrive from that. Can you tell us a bit more about that experience for you?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's a good point. I, I will also say it's a little bit hard to say if we have to define like positive and negative.
Hmm.
Obviously, there's a set of traumatic events that can happen, and adverse childhood experiences and all of that that can affect attachment and some people, which we can't minimize. But I think even my own experience, right, it has played out differently in relationships and relating to others as well. And for me, it took a lot of diving into the work and understanding myself and how that period of time may have affected me. So I don't think it was good or bad. I think it was more that I did have to do the work and I had to start to understand and gain the insight into how that framed and start to turn that more into like my superpower, right? Of, oh,
Hmm.
I actually had that experience. In a way, it was beneficial to be able to connect with that side of me and that side of my genetics and that side of my family. And how am I going to leverage that to be a more wholesome, holistic person and make change happen? And so we all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different experiences. And I think that if we can pause and dive in and do the work to understand and gain that insight, we can start to leverage it to our benefit.
Hmm. Hmm. I really appreciate you making that clarification, and the positive versus negative piece. And I think that you're completely right. And I think that I will say it's a whole lot more nuanced than what I just presented it as. There's
Or
so many other pieces that come along with it that can impact the trajectory that it creates for a person. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I want to, I pulled up one of these points for us to talk about, and I think that this is a good place to slot it in. And then we'll come back to some of the other things that you brought up in your story that tell us a little bit, are there differences between cultures in terms of parenting, child raising from India versus USA versus maybe some of the other parts of the world that you've experienced?
Mhm. Yeah, I think, it's a good question, and things have shifted a lot in the past few decades, primarily because of, accessibility, the internet, the ability to travel much more easily. And in a way, unique cultures are still there, but there's also sort of a much more interdisciplinary or like mingling of cultures happening. And so even within one country like India, there's hundreds of different cultures going on. And then you look at urbanization versus more rural communities, and there's differences there as well. But traditionally, the way that I've experienced it is that within South Asian cultures in particular, and I think also generally in Asian cultures, there's historically a lot more joint living or generational living households. And what that means is that the children are exposed to, grandparents and uncles and parents and siblings and cousins much more frequently. And so that whole idea that it takes a village to raise a child, well, that community is really there. And what we see happening now is even in places like India, there's a lot more urbanization happening, people moving to the cities, they're living a little bit more independently. It has shifted to more of what we see in the US, which is people living independently. And that leads to kids being raised by not as many people and not having exposure to as much of that. And, I think there's obviously pros and cons to some of that, but what we're really stepping away from, unfortunately, is that sense of community. And it comes back to that, if you don't have that sense of community, that sense of belonging doesn't show up. And the mosaic of your own like self-assembly starts to fall apart. And then we start to see a rise in folks, ending up on different points on the mental health spectrum. And we layer that in with then the influence of technology, where it even pulls you further away from those social relationships and community relationships. And we tend to have that problem. And so, I think my biggest takeaway is that we can learn a lot from other cultures and see what works and what doesn't work. But the biggest shifts that we've seen is moving away from sort of collective and community living environments to more independent and individualized environments. And that's not just in India or in other countries, but even in the US, if we look at it historically, 100 years ago, right, people lived a little bit more collectively in community versus independently. And so it's really important for us to think about that as well as we think about things like loneliness and mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got me. I read not too long ago The Anxious Generation, and Haidt talks about that right at the beginning about how we've moved away from that that village of within family, and then within the geographical location as well. Uh, I want to come back to. I'm going to come back to your community sustains us phrase
Mhm.
that you used at the beginning. But I want to just float something out there that I'm thinking about. You mentioned just a few minutes ago, as we were talking about the differences in culture, and you said, there's pros and cons with having that village, having those multi-generational homes. From an attachment perspective, what it's got me thinking about is we hear a lot in the attachment field when you're working with clients, I don't want to be my parent. I don't want to raise my kids like my parents raised me. And I'm just I'm just kind of throwing this out there. Like I'm wondering about those pros and cons of having different generations with under the same roof. And does that get exacerbated? Does it get minimized? I don't know. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and I think so I see it, right. So I have an older brother, and he has a 5-year-old who's now in kindergarten, which is wild. Um, and they actually, my parents were pretty involved with his care, and now they all live near each other as well, and it's hopeful, right. And I think that something that we really need to remember is that all of us are living this life for the first time, and that
Mm,
includes our parents, it includes our grandparents, it includes our nephews, nieces, and kids. So what that means is it's important to think about the human experience. Maybe our experience with a particular caregiver or parent was not as positive, but perhaps that person has learned from their experiences and they present differently as a grandparent or as an uncle or aunt. Obviously, there's unique situations where you don't want that exposure because of significant traumas or abuse and things like that. But oftentimes, grandparents present differently than they did with as a parent, and it's never going to be 100% perfect. Like the way that you
mhm,
parent is not going to be the same way that your mom or your dad is going to treat your child, and you're going to get into conflict. But what we know from the research and what we know from the benefits, right, of practical benefits in practice is that exposure to those family members is still very helpful. And
mhm.
there is the fear of intergenerational trauma and passing that on, but by having the exposure and actually talking about things along the way, you can start to heal those patterns as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you avoid them and you're just exposing everyone to it, then that's a different story. But if you can start to be together and you can start to sit in the levels of discomfort, and as adults or developmentally matured mindset, you have those conversations, then you can actually do a lot of healing. And so, I think there is a fear, but also like you can't really. I mean, I don't remember how many kids you have, but it's like you can't really raise them on your own necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
there's benefit. And when I say, community and family system, that doesn't necessarily mean like blood relatives these days, right? It's also, do you have a community of other people who are around you?
Right, right. Well, so okay, so you said community sustains us, and you've kind of touched on that a little bit, but dive in a bit more. How do you see community benefiting individuals and maybe families?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just tell you from a personal story. So, I was training in psychiatry in LA, and COVID hit, and I was pretty isolated. All I kind of did was go to the hospital to work, and I came home, and that's what I had. And there was a point where I got pretty isolated and depressed and suicidal. And I think for me, what I was able to do at the time, was I had gotten a call from a friend, whether she sensed it or not, what was going on. That's what happened, and it was very fast for her to gather together some of my close friends and community and kind of show up. And I think that that's really what we need is a sense of feeling like you have others who are in your court, and that's at the very least, right? And that in itself is healing. I think when it comes to families, parents in particular, like they have a child and they're just on their own journey. We don't really do a good job of supporting. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but we don't really do a good job, at least in this country, of supporting parents after they have a child and what to do and next step. It's kind of like out the door on your own. And so they go to places like Facebook groups or to blogs or to friends, and they try to find support. But there's no user's manual to that. And so that's a place where, being able to connect with others and getting support, being able to talk about the real tough stuff, like, hey, I love my kid, but I'm also super annoyed right now,
Mm-hmm.
and they drive me crazy, and to not feel guilt. How do we create safe spaces where you can connect with one another and not feel shame and guilt about it? And that's really what it comes down to. And so I'm finding this more and more in my clinical practice as I work with folks across ages, but particularly in those that are younger, adolescents and 20s and 30s, where they're trying to find friends and to connect with one another, and it's becoming very difficult. And it may seem like they have a lot of friends because they're chatting with folks online on Discord or Instagram or Snapchat or playing games, but if you don't have that real life connection, you're missing a lot on the types of hormones that are released that make you feel good and connect with someone else. The sense of belonging, like the intimacy in friendship as well, that comes with that. And we're missing a lot of that. And so, men in particular, we know that these days they have 50% less friends than they used to a few decades ago. And that leads to a lot of other issues. So, I'm going off on a few of these examples, but I think that the real core of it is that we're humans and we need one another to be able to connect at the essence of it. And we can talk about all these other avenues of connection, and we can talk about all these other avenues of optimizing for health, but the core of it is really like, do you have a couple people that you could call upon to share a meal and sit with and talk?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I want to add to that, and you said it just a few minutes ago that yes, it is to just talk, but often we need it to be at that deeper level, which to me was really hitting on the attachment piece of attachment. Part of what I understand as attachment is these experiences of safety, comfort, and reciprocal joy, right? And it's unconditional, really, that you are accepted. And you talked about your friend rallying your group together to just be with you in that discomfort and be with you in this hard time and place that you were experiencing. And so when you mention and say community sustains us, yes, I see it on a very high level, but I just see it on that much, much deeper level too, that it is speaking to our primal innate need for attachment to somebody, to have someone
Yeah.
be that safe place for us.
Right. And to feel secure in
Hmm.
that. And you know, we think about that from early childhood experiences, right? Of how kids really learn how to relate to the world and with others through what they're seeing modeled to them from the adults around them. And that's how you form some of these attachment styles, right? Whether it's anxious or secure or avoidant. And oftentimes we're all sort of a mosaic of some percentage of those throughout
Right.
our life. And so yes, and it's the same way with friendships or with romantic relationships. You form those attachment styles, and so the best thing that we can do in this day and age as individuals is to make sure that we're like leaving that door open for somebody else to feel like they can start to develop that. And it's all not always going to be 100%, and it's going to be scary, but you know, the question that really comes up for me these days is like, have humans become afraid to sit in the discomfort?
Hmm.
And that's leading to us all becoming avoidant of the hard stuff. And then we feel depressed and anxious and don't have a sense of belonging.
Hmm.
So, you know, if there's a takeaway we can have right now from what we're speaking about is to embrace that discomfort a little bit more and hold that space for one another. And then we start to develop more secure attachment, because your attachment style is not formed just based on what's happened to you in childhood. It changes and it molds as you go through life.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you're talking about this because I don't do this very often, but a little plug to the treatment model that we use in our organization is that one of the concepts that informs it, we call it sitting in the yuck, and it's exactly what you're talking about. It's, how comfortable can we be as a caregiver or a parent or someone who is working with a young person who is struggling with sitting in that discomfort with them. And I'm certain that's what you do with your clients that you work with, on a daily basis.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also why I'm really excited, you know, that to have launched Ginkgo as well, which I'm sure we'll dive into, because it's the yes, it's a new tool. It's a, you know, it's a clinically backed tool to help parents navigate the digital world with their families and to help build healthier relationships with tech. However, it's framed upon these really deeply rooted developmental psychology topics, right, of attachment theory and so forth. And we're essentially Trojan horsing this larger picture of connecting people back to each other through it.
Hmm. Hmm. Which I love because, and you mentioned this a little bit ago, but there's so much of technology is disconnecting us. And so I love that you are using technology to help parents and families reconnect in that way.
Mhm.
Um, I do want to talk a bit more about Ginkgo, but I want to touch on one other thing that you mentioned in one of our previous conversations, and um, it was because it stood out to me. You had and you can correct me if I missay this, but
Sure.
you had mentioned that you had helped fund or find not fund find a 24-hour mental health hotline in India,
Mhm.
and so I guess I'm just interested, and I'm certain that all of it is going to be applicable, but how much of what we've already talked about kind of shows up in that work that, those responders are doing and engaging in with individuals over there.
Quite a bit is the big,
Right.
right? But yes, so through Minds Foundation, which is the nonprofit I started in 2010, we launched the first 24-hour toll-free helpline staffed by clinical psychologists. And you know, it's interesting. When we had an assumption, which was that, or a hypothesis that most of our calls will come from the younger generation and from urban areas, you know, places like Mumbai, Pune, Delhi, etc. But we were wrong. 70% of our calls came from rural India,
Mm,
uh, which was very interesting. And so, you know, and a lot of it was around attachment. It's I'm in this relationship and I'm being treated this way, but I'm stuck based on the factors of how I grew up and what I've seen. And is this appropriate? Is this right? So we've had a lot of that. And then, we've also obviously fielded a lot of calls from students as well who are very stressed out and high pressure, high expectations. And that all does play culturally into some of the attachment styles as well. So we do see it happening, and I see that happening here in the US as well. And, I think that the conversation has to be much more open about attachment styles. And when we do a really good job these days in general of talking about mental health with not as much stigma as we had maybe 10 years ago. But the next layer of that is really to say, hey, it's not just recognizing your mental health, it's actually starting to pause and sit in the yuck, as you said,
Mhm.
understanding where it's coming from. And the attachment styles come in, the other types of developmental milestones come in, the complex traumas come in, all of that, your epigenetics. So I'm hoping that sort of like the mental health conversation 2.0 is more about, okay, we know that these things exist, we're comfortable talking about it, but now it's about creating spaces for people to really dive in and comfortably speak about those difficult topics.
Mhm.
They,
Mhm. I feel like it's almost been sensationalized that, oh, they had a bad childhood, or and instead of it being a place where we can sit in the discomfort and really dive into it, it's almost become sensationalized rather than this is a real thing, and not pointing fingers, but we know that a lot of our childhood shapes us and those experiences. And so how can we, instead of, and you mentioned it right at the beginning about your own experience, how can I view this as an acceptance, and then looking for where were the positives that came out of it? How has this
yeah,
shaped who I am in a positive way? Um, I think we kind of get stuck in so much of the hard stuff that we forget to remind our clients and our people that we're working with that they adapted, to meet the demands of their environment. And there are positive skills that come from that, Some of them even survived because of it. Um, and
yeah,
so,
yeah. And this is also why, my take on the psychodynamic approach is not to say that, recognize your defense and let it go. It's more recognize your defense and have a dialogue with it and thank it
mm,
for having you survive through certain things that were difficult. And how is it going to play into your life now, right? We don't have to stick to the script that we had as a child, but we could use it to empower who we are and change that narrative, right? So that's what I guess I'm talking about with sort of like mental health 2.0 conversation is, let's start to move from, okay, we've recognized the script and now I've had a hard childhood, I've had a hard relationship, and whatever it is that you've experienced, and start to say, I got that. Okay, that's what it was. And this is what I've learned. And this is the dialogue I'm going to have with myself now and my parts that I'm made up of, and move forward and start to empower myself to write my own script.
mhm. And then, if I might be presumptuous and say maybe mental health 3.0 is how do I take that and apply it so my children have a different experience. But anyway,
Exactly.
that's another.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're not, nothing is permanent.
Right, right, right. So, okay, so you mentioned a little bit about Ginkgo. Um, tell us just a little bit more about how you developed it, how it began, and you can maybe share a little bit about your partner who's involved in Ginkgo too. Just
Yeah.
the floor is yours.
Yeah, yeah. No, for sure. So I met my co-founder and best friend, Larissa May, or as she goes by Lars, 6 years ago. We were actually both ambassadors for a online peer mental health group that a friend was running. And then we met during COVID, became fast friends. She was running a nonprofit called Half the Story. I had Minds Foundation and I was training in psychiatry. And I had an opportunity to do some research with her through Half the Story as an advisor. And we always knew we'd start something. And what really happened was, Lars was getting a lot of messages through her Instagram DMs from parents who were struggling with their kids of, my kid got a nude, my kid got an inappropriate message, they won't get off their screen, we're having screen fights. And we recognize, there's over 500 screen fights a year in each household on average. that are happening. And we know that 77% of pediatricians don't even ask about the use of technology in their homes. And so all these stats, I can go off on, but we know there's a problem. And Lars and I came together to say, hey, you know, there's screen time apps that block screen time. There's surveillance apps where parents can see what their kids are doing, but that's not really bringing the family together. That's actually harming the attachment amongst the family members in the household. So what can we create that's preventative and educational and tangible and actionable, that's clinically backed, that families can use? And at the bigger vision is, how can we use technology as a window or a lens into the health of the digital wellness of a family? That's really what this is. And so we've developed Ginkgo. It's Ginko, inspired by the Ginkgo tree, which is one of the oldest trees in the world, and is a symbol of resilience. And we wanted to create something that really supports families all the way from toddlers to teens, giving them personalized guidance for every developmental age. And so that's sort of what our range is. We really try to focus a sweet spot on ages 6 to 14, which is often when kids are exposed to a lot of tech. And to kind of tie this in a little bit to what we've been speaking about so far, we think of Ginkgo, we think about screens in a developmental way, the way that we think about childhood and milestones and stages. So like a 3-year-old's relationship with their device or technology is very different from a 13-year-old's.
Mm-hmm.
And so our tools have to grow alongside that. And that's also one of the reasons why, our stance is not to say no tech until 14 or 15 or 16, but instead it's to say, how do we help you build a healthy relationship with technology the same way that we teach kids to build healthy relationships with food?
Mm-hmm.
Can't have it just go away. It's about how is this going to incorporate into your life? So we borrow a lot from, Bobley and Ainsworth, like traditional attachment theory. Kids relate to the world through their parents, as I mentioned before. And that also means that tech shouldn't disrupt that. They're going to look at modeling from their parents on how their parents are interacting with technology. So, things like co-using technology, watching movies together, playing a game together, these help to build those healthy relationships. And this is the framework we use to provide personalized guidance through our AI chat as well through Ginkgo. So we're reinforcing sense of safety and connection rather than replacing it. One other thing I'll mention on the developmental side is Ericksonian stages of development, which we really incorporate. So, one of the examples, as you might be familiar with, is industry versus inferiority, which is a stage in kind of like late childhood. And this is where kids are building competence around things. And so we can really leverage digital tools at that stage for skill building and creativity, et cetera, instead of endless consumption. So it's actually a really important stage where we start to teach them how to use it to their advantage without the technology taking them over. So the digital world becomes a stage where they're trying to figure out who they are. And it's really our role to help them explore and express themselves online without falling into those traps of drama and comparison, et cetera, and things like that. And even when they move on from there to developing identity and intimacy and relationships, we start to teach them balance. And so all of our guidance is really framed in these age groups and these developmental stages. And so if you use it as a tool, as a parent or as a caregiver, or as an aunt or uncle or grandparent to get advice, the results and the guidance we give is really based on those stages. And that's something that we're really proud of because no other tool out there accounts for that.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're also accounting for neurodivergent traits as well, which no other tool is accounting for. So things are a little bit different, right? If someone has dyslexia or ADHD or autism. And so we really want to make sure we're comprehensive in that stage. So yeah, it's a tool and it's a company that's focused on moving beyond setting limits. It's actually about how do we help families use these screens to support attachment, identity, and growth, not just in the child, but in the actual family system.
I love that your stance is not just to completely get rid of tech. We've had a lot of the same, we have the same conversations with the families that we work with too. And it's, we understand that tech, I mean, here's you and me, we're using tech
Mhm.
right now, right? We wouldn't be able to do this otherwise. And so it's
And this is
so,
active use.
what's that?
This is active use versus passive use, right?
Right, right. And I love that you're not just, saying don't do it. I mean, it would be great if we could do that, but it's just not realistic, right? It's not realistic for anyone. And so and that would be setting our families up for failure, right? If that's what we encourage them to do. We all know, well, if you've had a teen in your tween or a teen in your life, trying to tell them that they can't have a cell phone or can't have this social media app, how hard it can be to help to explain it to them. And so I kind of hear that that would be like an example that maybe your app could help with. Like, how do I help my teen find balance knowing that all of their friends are on the same app and doing the
Mhm.
same thing? So,
Exactly. And that's a question you could ask Ginkgo,
mhm,
and it will give you some guidance for that. And you can personalize it even more, right? And say that, oh, well, my kid really likes to dance or play soccer. And it will create a whole guidebook for you for the week on how do I slowly start to have this conversation over the course of, 5 days with my kid and incorporating in their interests and hobbies, etc. And so
mhm.
that's where the personalization piece comes in.
I like that a lot. And the other thing that stood out to me that you had me thinking about, and it brought up the term co-regulation.
Mhm.
You mentioned about, our children are watching us, they're modeling their own behaviors based on what they see with us. And then you talked about, watching a movie together, playing a game together, using the screen together. Um, and I really was like, okay, yeah, that's a great opportunity for that co-regulation piece. Like, okay, now it's time for us to stop. Mom and you are gonna stop playing, and whew, it can be hard sometimes when we have to stop what we're doing, but I'm doing it with you rather than expecting you to do it by yourself.
100%. Yeah. And if you ask kids, actually, you should start doing this with some of your clients and families. Say, hey, who actually struggles the most with their phone? And they'll probably point to a parent or adult in the house, right? And so we're not even aware of it sometimes. And so, as much as this exercise is to say, hey, I'm trying to help my kid, you're really helping the whole system.
Well, and yeah, I think to give our adults some grace out there,
Yeah.
I would certainly say for me, uh, it's a constant battle for me to say, don't pick up your phone, don't pick up your phone. You don't need to look at your phone right now. Like you are with your child, you know, even if, and the temptation is so strong, you're there and maybe the child is playing independently, which is great. And then you pick up your phone and then a minute later they've stopped playing and they've been watching you the whole time while you've been on your phone. It's extremely difficult, and I think had I not been in this field, I definitely wouldn't be as mindful of it. Um,
Yeah. Because kids are like sponges, right?
yes.
So they're absorbing everything around them. And that example that you just gave of, okay, well, this child is playing, but then you pick your phone up and they realize that's what you're doing. I mean, if you think about that from some of those older attachment style experiments that Bobley and Answer did, that's almost equivalent to like the parent walking out of the door, right, and leaving the child there,
hmm
right?
hmm
They're not getting the attention that they need.
Right,
That this
right.
device or this object is more important than they are.
hmm hmm Well, and yeah, I mean, I always go to Edtronic's still face experiment and the power, the
Right.
impact that it has of in just such a short space of time on the child when you aren't present. Even your body's present, but you're emotionally and not responsive. It just blows my mind. And so, but I've been lucky enough to be in this field and seen something like that to give me that understanding. And so many of our parents and caregivers out there just don't, they haven't had that opportunity to gain that education piece around it.
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear actually from your experience too, in those moments where, like, how do you in your practice teach parents to start to actually show those emotions more and to be more present, because it can be challenging.
Well, for us, I feel like the conversation always begins with, tell me first of all, tell me what it was like being raised as a child, because some of our parents and caregivers haven't even had that experience themselves. And so, we know if you haven't had it, it's extremely hard for you to give it, first of all. Um, and then once we've, had an opportunity to allow them to talk about their journey, their story, their experiences, then we can start to move into, um, you know, tell me what it's like for you to share those feelings, emotions with your child and what comes up for you and so on. But it takes a lot of time and patience and creating that safe space again, for if I'm not trusting the person that I'm with, if they were to say to me, "Hey, did you know that when you get upset, your face looks a certain way, or when you get upset, you shut down." If I don't trust that person, I'm not going to be ready to hear that. I'm not going to be open to hearing that.
Right. And that still face experiment is really interesting, right? Because it's like it actually also highlights in modern day when people feel like they're connecting with others through text or digital interface.
Mm,
You're not getting
hmm
that emotional reaction through body language and behavior and emotional expression on the face.
hmm
And that's actually led to a lot of confusion in terms of delayed development and recognition of emotions in one another.
Yeah, I can I've heard that a lot and experienced it a lot with the teenagers that we work with who are outside of our treatment setting, but in the community of um, just that lack of understanding of how somebody might be. It's just impossible to convey it fully through a text message or, a screen.
Right,
So,
exactly. And so a lot of the, some of the guidance that we're providing through Ginkgo too for families is sort of Trojan horsing and, in real life ways of connecting with one another. We have a very specific feature called the playbook. And so you can ask the clinically backed AI the questions, and it can also create a playbook for you, which kind of tells you it's basically a guide for the next few days of how do you start to work on this issue of concern and the types of questions to bring up, the types of activities that you can do with them. And so it's really starting to help build these attachment styles that are healthy and positive based on their stages of development. And that's what we're trying to do, because it can be very overwhelming to, you know, do what you're saying, right? Which is like talking to the family and the teen and the
mhm.
parent and say, this is the type of stuff that needs to change. But if we can give a guidebook or this playbook on how they can do it over time, it's a little bit more tangible and actionable. And that's really the focus.
Um, Before we wrap up, you mentioned earlier, and this is probably going to be of interest to a lot of our listeners, that the app itself takes into or can take into consideration neurodivergent children. Tell us a little bit more about that because I think it's so vital for and some of the children that we work with from a developmental trauma and attachment lens, would be considered neurodivergent. So yeah, I guess just share a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So when you sign up for Ginkgo as a parent, you add your child or children and you add their date of birth. So we know kind of where they're at developmentally. You onboard with some of your family values, but you also are able to select if they have neurodivergent traits or diagnoses. And that will actually feed into our AI so that you're getting specific information based on that. So for example, if you're saying, hey, I'm having a really hard time with getting my child to bed at night. They're really stuck to their tablet. Well, if they have a lot of sensory motor behavior and are diagnosed with autism, you can't necessarily approach them the same way that you would someone that doesn't have that. And so
Hmm
we're able to give you guidance specifically on how do we move away from the device as a transitional object to something else and actually have communication. And it's a slower path to transition than you would with someone that maybe does not have that type of symptom or behavior. And so that's really what we're accounting for. Things like ADHD as well, the guidance will account for things like more time blocks and scheduling and much more clear communication with the child. If they have anxiety, again, saying, hey, it's important to sit down and actually talk through the schedule a little bit more, visualize it, write it out with them so that they know what's coming up and it's not uncertain. And so that's really where it comes in, is the advice we give switches a little bit and becomes a bit more personalized based on the child's symptoms and their behaviors. And the more you use it, the more it will learn about that child. Moving forward, what we're developing actually is really targeted at a larger neuropsychological assessment. As you know, in your practice, I'm sure you know this as well, is that on average across the world, or the Western world, there's about a 6 to 12 month wait time to get formal neuropsych assessment, which is a large chunk of a child's lifetime, if you can think about that, and the academic performance and the social performance and those issues that can come up. What we're actually building into Ginko is the ability to collect some of that data for neuropsych assessment and give you interventions that you can start to do at home that are actionable and implementable. And by the time you get to the pediatrician or the psychologist to do the assessment, you already have that set of data. And so you're not losing as much of that time, and you can really start to intervene early. And so we hope that as that continues to build, we'll be able to be better at doing early detection of these issues as well.
I love that. I love the sense of kind of empowerment that would give a parent or a caregiver, and also uh, a greater kind of ability to advocate for themselves when they go into those assessments and say, hey, we have tried this. Here's the data. Here's what we've been tracking. Here's what we've been doing. Um, I
And
know
that's the
myself.
wait
Go
list.
ahead.
That's the wait list to get to an assessment, not even the intervention part. So
Right, absolutely. And I know myself personally, having used certain apps to help, like when you go into a doctor's office, I don't know what it is, but at least this is my experience. I feel like I don't know a single thing in the entire world. It's like I walk in and suddenly I don't know anything. And so that's where I see like this type of app being so helpful, that now I can go and I have evidence of a sort to be able to share and to be able to say to the doctor, psychiatrist, whoever I'm meeting with, like, here's what we've been trying already and what we see working and not working. And like, I do know my child kind of thing.
yeah, and we know early intervention is key, especially for these types of diagnoses. And so
Mhm.
that's our goal, is how do we start to allow families to collaborate more with the clinical system as well.
And build that community, right?
Yeah,
Build
maybe
that
it's a different
community.
conversation of how we should be designing doctors' offices differently.
Yeah, we could probably talk for a long time about that. But Raghu, this conversation has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I will be sharing, we'll be sharing where people can access the app with the show notes. And but I think that they're going to be very, very interested. So I just appreciate you coming on and sharing it with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And it's always fun diving into this stuff. I love just nerding out about the psychology. And I think that for me, being able to team up with someone like Lars on this has been really great, because I can like intercept all my clinical knowledge into this tool. And yeah, hopefully together we can, create a platform that really helps families and communities thrive and come together.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much.